Hello, my name is Jerry Schroeder, and in these few moments we spent together, I'd like to discuss the concept of petitionary prayer. Prayer has been such a part of the environment for persons who believe in a superpowering God or creating God, and prayer is common to most cultures. The question is, does it work, and does God want it to work? On this many studies, scientific studies would have tried to determine whether or not you can prove that petitionary prayer, asking for something, do you get it? It's not some of the experiments show yes, and some show no, and some are unequivocal. And as a scientist, therefore, my opinion is it's undetermined. Nonetheless, I do happen to pray. I'm an Orthodox Jew. The other aspect is what about God? Does God want petitionary prayer? And that's quite clear from the text that God calls for or expects petitionary prayer when we need something. I would say one of the key examples of this would be that in Exodus, in chapter 32, the second book of the Bible, I work with the Hebrew Bible and the Hebrew, although this talk is obviously would be in English. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the 5 books of the Bible. So in the second book of the Bible, we've had our Exodus. We've come out of Egypt. We were barely out a month or so, and we being my forefathers, are building a golden calf. As my wife, Barbara Sofer, the author says, they must have been crazy. I mean, God just did all these miracles, and we're building a golden calf already. It's hard to believe. Moses has gone up to God and is receiving at this very moment the 10 Commandments. He comes down with the 2 tablets, sees this debauchery going on, smashes the tablets, the first set of tablets. He goes up later a second time, and then he says to Moses the most amazing thing. He says all this in chapter 32, 33 of Exodus. He says to Moses, Hanichali, leave me alone. God says to Moses, leave me alone so that I can destroy the people. Do you realize what that sentence is? God is asking Moses, leave me alone so I can destroy the people. Clearly what God is asking for is Moses argue for the people, which of course Moses does, and does quite effectively. So we see this concept of there being an actual request by God for us to make a prayer when we want a certain aspect. And there are 3 key places that I find in the Bible where, in fact, petitionary prayer shows up in the 5 books of Moses. There is in Psalms several places. The key place that I know is where petitionary prayer is talked about is Psalm number 30. And in Psalm 30, we read quite clearly that in the midst of the psalm, the psalmist says, I thought in my security I would never be shaken. O Lord, by thy favor thou hast established my mountain you established my mountain as a stronghold. But when thy favor was destroyed, I was dismayed. To thee, O Lord, I called, I appealed to God. What profit is if I go to the grave, etc. Then it says, towards the end, thou hast changed my mourning to dancing, and put off my sackcloth, girded me with joy. So the prayer was actually made, explicit prayer, and was answered in a positive way. The 3 places that I see specifically within the 5 books of Moses, that was Psalm number 30. The one is again at the golden calf in Exodus, and then later when we have come out of Egypt and been forgiven for the golden calf, and now we're about to come into the land of Egypt, into the land of Canaan, or the promised land, and Moses sends in some 12 spies to check out the situation, and they come back and say it's a great land, but the people are giants there. Let's go back. This chapter 14 of the book of Numbers, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, 4th book of the Bible, Bamidbar in Hebrew, Bamidbar, and God is furious because we're about to go in, and the people are fearful of going in. And the 3rd place is in the book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 3, the 5th book of the Bible, where Moses is pleading with God that he should be allowed to go into the land, the promised land, and God is arguing against this. So let's look at each of those three. The golden calf, the spies in the desert, and Moses asking to come into the promised land along with the people when they crossed the Jordan from the east side to into the promised land. In Exodus, the golden calf is built. God is furious and says, I'm going to destroy you, destroy the people, and tells Moses, leave me alone. And Moses then argues in the most amazing way. I mean, the logic is just extraordinary. What Moses doesn't say is, they'll never do this again. They'll always pray. They'll always believe in you. They'll always follow you. That's the argument is zero, never. What's the argument that Moses uses? Moses says the following. If you destroy these people as a group right now in the desert, having just brought them out of Egypt, the Egyptians will say, you just brought them out into the desert to kill them. And that's the logic. These people are known as your people. You took them out in the desert to kill them. The Egyptians will say, well, who cares what the Egyptians say? We just had an exodus. God took us out of there. No one cares about. Yeah. God cares about what the Egyptians will say. And God says to Moses, essentially, you're right. Those that worship the calf will be punished, and they will be punished, but I will not destroy the people. A similar phenomenon occurs exactly in parallel with when Moses comes at the Jordan River, crossing from the east side into the promised west side. The other side is Jericho. It's on the west side of the Jordan. I'm talking to you from Jerusalem at the moment. I'm not high enough to see over the hills to see that far. But if I got up a few, many stories up, I would be able possibly to see the area. In any event, they're about to cross over into the land, but Moses wants to check out the area. It's a good idea to let the people know what they're going to expect. Moses sends in 12 spies, 12 chiefs of the tribes. There were 12 men. No women were included at that time. Okay, that may have been part of the problem, but certainly my wife Barbara would say that is probably the problem. But in any event, the men go in, and they can come back, and they all say the land is phenomenal, and they bring back fruit, magnificent, wonderful, and extraordinary. And then 10 of the men say the following: but the people there are real giants. We can't beat them. There's no way. Let's go back to Egypt. Well, Joshua and Caleb, two of the men say, no, we can do it. God's on our side. But it's 10 so there's 10 that say no, 2 that say yes. So it's 10 against 2. The 10 majority win, and the approach is to go back to Egypt. Well, God is furious. This time God hits the roof. I mean, this is just too much. I brought you out of Egypt. I took you through here. We got to here. And it's a loser. They don't want to go in. So God says, I'm going to destroy these people. Moses, I'll make you a better people. They'll follow you. You won't have all these heartaches, etc. And what does Moses say? Exactly what Moses said to the golden calf. It is true, God, you are certainly strong enough to destroy all these people. But it's not your interest. Because, see, we are known as, the people of the Israelites, Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, this Hebrew-speaking people, is known as your children, as your people. And if you kill us in the desert now, what the nations of the world, what the nations of the world will say is that the reason that God killed his people in the desert, about to cross the Jordan into the promised land, is that God wasn't strong enough to help his people defeat the inhabitants or drive the inhabitants. Actually, in the end, they drive them out, they're not killed. To drive out the inhabitants of the land. And so since God couldn't get them to keep the land, guess what God did? God destroyed them. And God says, Moses, you're right. The nations will say that. I'll punish those that said to go back. And there's a very interesting nuance we don't have time to get into about everyone over, essentially everyone over 20. Men, the women don't die in the desert because the women didn't say go back. The men said go back. You can read that very clearly in the text. That it's not feminist or not feminist. The simple fact is the text makes it clear. The men said go back, but only over 20, because under 20 there's an aspect of impulsiveness, and there's a biological reason for that also. That it's the connection between the amygdala, which is fight or flight, or punch in the nose or run away, and the frontal cortex are joined neurologically, so they can have a debate inside your head. It's all subconscious, but there's a debate. Should I hit him in the head, or should I run away, or maybe he's too big for me? The difficulty is, this is the logic. This is the fight and flight. The information comes in, eyes, ears, smell, goes to the thalamus, a part of your brain, which then sends the information to the logic, to the amygdala. And the amygdala always gets it a tiny bit sooner than the logic, because it's survival. It's running away before the logic. But then there's a good connection here, except that connection is only myelinated. That is to say, the nerves only can send signals. After that, those nerves are coated with an insulator called myelin. It's like a fatty tissue. In fact, multiple sclerosis is when the body confuses the myelin, the fatty insulator on the nerves, and nerves are electrical signals, and your body is a saltwater system. Salt water conducts electricity. You put an electrical conductor in salt water, you get a short circuit. So the myelin, the fatty layers, insulates those wires that we call the axons of the wires of the neurons, the nerves. So the connection between the amygdala and here, while the wires exist, they're not insulated. So the amygdala and the logic can't communicate. The logic gets it first, and only by late teens and early 20s is that myelinated. And so anyone less than 20 can't be held for saying, let's go back to Egypt, because the information got to the fight and flight before it got to the frontal cortex. Anyone who's raised a teenager knows very well. Much more impulsive in teenage years. Finally, when you get in 20s and early 20s, you're more logical. And literally, because the logic up here, the frontal cortex, is overriding the fight and flight of the amygdala, unless fight and flight convinces the logic. Do it. So Moses says, all those over 20 are going to perish in the desert. And that's the beginning of what they call the 40-year mark, 40 years in the desert. Actually, it's 38 years, because 2 years have already gone by. So for the next 38 years, then people walk in the desert. And those that were responsible for saying, let's go back to Egypt, perish in the desert. And the others come and go into the land. And then that brings us up to Deuteronomy chapter 3, where we have now Moses is on the border of going in. The people are about to go in. Moses asks God, can I please go in with them? Because although I made one mistake way back then in the desert, because the people were so nasty and yelling water and yelling at me and yelling at Aaron, can I go into the land? And God says, no. And Moses asks again, and God says, no. Finally, God says point blank, don't bring up the subject again. You're not going in. So it's interesting. Of the three key places of petitionary prayer, all three had problems. But two were granted, but one wasn't. In other words, every petitionary prayer, if there's a strong reason for not granting it, and there may have been several reasons behind why God kept Moses back, but in any event, there were two successful reasons, and one request that was said no. I would say the roundup of this discussion, though, is that even in the cases of extreme transgression, like the golden calf. Okay, the people at the Jordan in chapter 14 of Midbar of Numbers, they're afraid to go, and that's fear. But the golden calf, they just came out of Egypt. I mean, how much power does God have to show? At the golden calf, that was pretty inexcusable. But it was excused by the prayer and the logic. So even what we learn from that is, even in extreme cases where you know you're wrong, I did wrong, I know I did wrong, God still wants your prayer. The God of the Bible wants your prayer. Never confuse misconceptions of what God should be or is with the God as described in the Bible. For that, I wrote my fourth book called God According to God. God is described in the Bible in a way that matches the way the world runs, spot on spot. God wants our prayer, and God listens to our prayer, and that is the God of the Bible. Whether the tests show yes or no, well, sometimes the answer is yes, and as we see in the Bible itself, sometimes the answer is no. So my suggestion is, if you're going to ask for a prayer, develop a relationship with whom you're discussing this. Just as you wouldn't argue with the greengrocer or have a discussion with the greengrocer with the same way you would have with your spouse, because you have a relationship with your spouse that is vastly deeper, I hope, than with your greengrocer. And make that relationship with your spouse deep, and make that relationship with the creator of the universe deep.